Thank you, Professor. Now I would like to invite Professor Arnold de Meyer back up on stage to moderate the question and answer session. Professor de Meyer, please. And ladies and gentlemen, the question and answer session is now officially open. And so please identify yourselves and the organization you are from before posing your question. Those who would like to ask questions, I would like to invite you to queue up behind the microphones that are being placed at the aisles. Over to you, Professor de Meyer.
Thank you. You spoke with a lot of passion, which didn't leave us a lot of time for questions and answers.
I'm sorry about that.
That's, but we can take a few. But before I take a question of the audience, I have a very simple question that probably would require an hour answer, but I want to have one phrase. That is, I'm an engineer, and if you tell me that I have to do 6 things to get at the same time, I know I can't do it. I'm too simplistic. I need to have priorities. If you look at your 6 transitions, which one is the one where you would start?
I would say...
I know that economists can do more than one thing.
No. I would say parallel processing.
Yeah.
So I would really say we have we need a division of labor here, because in economics we call it the assignment problem, that each of these has a main way of approach, and for each of these challenges there's a principled thing that can be done that doesn't have to engage all of us all the time. So I would divvy up the responsibilities in cabinet and in our faculties. I would come together in group dynamic and group spirit, if it's a university context, in an interdisciplinary way to review, understand, adjust, and finally integrate these ideas. If it's in a cabinet, it would be through the planning unit in the Prime Minister's office. But I think that we really need to do a number of things now because our back is to the wall. And one thing that I do assume here, which is not so easy, is that we can mobilize the incremental resources to do it. I'm a big believer in taxes. I'm a big believer in raising public revenues for public investment. Or in, if it's a central provident fund, in at least mobilizing saving in a very active way so that it can be harnessed for the scale of investment that's needed. Singapore saves about 45% of GDP, which is quite wonderful. The United States is around 15% of GDP, trying really hard to get to zero because we love consumption so much. We need saving and investment at an ample rate so that the one answer that we don't have is we can't afford to do all of those things. Then I would say we really do need a kind of parallel processing to make the integration, but can be no delay in the energy transformation, there can be no delay in reform of agriculture, there can be no delay in educating our kids in the right way so that the education norms occur. No society should delay in mobilizing information technology and broadband and connectivity. So I'm really bad at budget constraints. I don't, even though that is something I was taught, I always say, oh, you can get the money or something more. It is true, the one thing that we can't figure out to make more of is attention span. And this is a very big problem. So I'm going to interrupt you, and I'm going to take 1 or 2 questions from the room. Are there any questions there? Yeah.
Hi, Professor. So I have a question on. So you talked a lot about these problems with the politics, with these transitions, but since we are in management university, in the private sector, there's this topic of a corporate social responsibility.
Yeah.
So do you believe that it's actually working? And do you think there's any advance that we can make on this front?
What's the role of business in this whole transition?
Well, of course, business has to deliver almost all of the substantive physical and software investments in the end, whether paid for by government or paid for by private demand. And everything would be easier if market prices and regulation gave the right incentives. The reason, or a key reason, why we don't get out of the energy transition, of course, is that we don't have a price on carbon. And I know this is something that's being debated here because I read about the debate in the newspaper on the flight in just now. We have costly CO2, but no price on free emission of CO2. The business community would be guided much better if there were ways to price destruction of biodiversity or emission of CO2. So whenever you can make a decentralized price system work for you, that helps the business issues. Of course, getting there requires politics. And it's not a technical solution to put a price on carbon, it's a political solution. It's not a technical solution to regulate land, that's a political solution to say we set a boundary around that. What is the business responsibility beyond that? Well, obviously one part should be obeying the law. That's a minimal standard which is not satisfied in the United States, for example, on Wall Street, where illegal action is taken to be fairly normal and the fines are taken to be the cost of doing business. And a lot of the 2008 financial crisis was not just the accidents of a financial panic, it was malfeasance and financial fraud in which the banks got bailed out and ended up paying tens of billions of dollars of fines, but compared to their profits, that was the cost of doing business. So legality is an issue. The one that I'm most interested in on corporate social responsibility is this. If you are a business and you know that your business activity is damaging, but it's not illegal, what is your responsibility as a manager? We have hedge funds that buy, say, drug companies because they say to the drug company, you should jack up the price of your drug. And the CEO says, no, that would be very damaging for people. And the hedge fund says, what are you talking about? You could triple the profits. And if you're a responsible manager under this kind of capitalism, you end up getting bought out. And this is what happened with Unilever also this past year. Paul Pullman is one of the great CEOs of sustainable development in the world, and he was challenged by rather rapacious hedge fund takeover. The board backed him up, but it's indicative of the kind of problems that we face. So my view is we ought to have a clear standard in company law and board responsibility that you're not allowed to make profits that aren't true value added but are at the cost of others. Basically, that you have to internalize your own externalities even if government is not internalizing your own externalities. In some types of capitalism, especially in Northern Europe, that's more or less accepted. In the United States now, that's a foreign language for business. The idea is maximize wealth, and you're a fool if you don't. And that is enormously destructive because the regulations can never keep up with the new, clever ways to be destructive. And market economy absolutely gives constantly options to make money, not through true value added, but at the expense of others. And it should be a core principle that you don't do that. My wife is a doctor. She took the Hippocratic Oath starting and it starts with no lo nocere. First, do no harm. But that is not the business code, and it should be.
I have time for one more question, I think. Yes, I have done one in the corner. If you can run down and just also mention who you are.
Not to fall over. Hi, Professor Sachs. So I'm Kenjin. And first of all, I just want to say before I begin my comment that I'm thankful for your passion, and thank you very much for you do it, because I consider myself an environmentalist as well. So with that, I will put forth the devil's advocate position, and I'll challenge some of the points. The first one, you started off by saying that it's, the sustainable goals, development goals were globally agreed to, and I would challenge that because it was agreed to by governments, as you pointed out, and not by people. And it is because people were not fully engaged, and that's why we see governments pulling out right now because of the turn of political events, which goes on to my other point about education. You talked about education just now, and I say yes, but it's not just for the kids, because I think it's about educating people to reach across that political divide. I can sense your passion, and I do consider myself a liberal as well, but I think it is because of this political polarity. I mean, you talked about income inequality, but I also I would put it forth that political polarity is also has a part to play in where we are right now. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, it is an interesting question. How would you reach an agreement of people, not governments? Because we have government in our ideal form as representing the common interest of their populations. And we do have a United Nations, which starts out in its charters, we the peoples, but it is an organization of governments. And we don't have a mechanism in almost any society to have agreement of people, per se. When Aristotle wrote The Politics, inventing Western political theory, the city-state was small enough that you could actually stand out in the Acropolis and have a vote of the citizens. But we moved to government as representative. It happens that there was an attempt at big outreach. Actually, millions and millions of people were engaged in an active outreach. But I agree with you, you couldn't say it was a people's agreement. I do believe, by the way, deeply that it's in the people's interest and that this wasn't a fast one on the people. This is really reflecting a common interest. But it is a challenge, and one wonders whether in our connected, ubiquitous age, we could actually invent a new kind of politics where people directly vote. I'd love to actually get rid of Congress and have...
we noticed that.
Yes, and have they don't represent us, they represent powerful lobbies. To have wiki legislation, because we have Wikipedia as our public, well, we could write better legislation as wiki legislation, and then we could all vote on it online. And I think we'd actually end up better off. And it comes to the second question about the polarization. It's interesting, we actually don't have such a polarized electorate in the United States, for example. And it's interesting to look at the data, which I do pore over day by day. The American people, roughly 65 to 35 or 70 to 30, agree on almost all important issues. But the 30 almost invariably is winning right now, or the 10 or even 2% is winning, because the outcomes processed by the political system are not based on public opinion. They're based on the powerful interests that fund the candidates. And it's a strange thing that's going on in American politics. I'm just using it as an example, but it's on my mind, obviously. You have terrible legislation that the public hates, like this new tax cut that will be proposed. No one's in favor of it. Like the attempt to overthrow President Obama's healthcare system a couple of months ago, everyone was against it. But yet the Republican Party voted almost unanimously for it. Why? Well, they know that this is awful. But what they're told is by the big campaign financiers, if you oppose us, we will run an opponent against you or we'll run ads against you. It's a threat basis. And that's why these 2 Republican senators recently announced their retirement. They're under threat. So we have these billionaires running around who have a disproportionate effect on politics right now. And it comes to the Republican primary, and then that determines outcomes of different parts of the country for a lot of interesting reasons. In other words, we've asked in economics and political theory for a long time, what kind of institutions translate the public good into actual outcomes? Not the ones we have right now. But it's not polarization per se, though we do have that. We're yelling at each other, but a lot of it is stoked by special interests. And a lot of the polarization, by the way, there's actually one horrible person behind a lot of it, and that's Rupert Murdoch, who is a really rich, really nasty person who runs a criminal enterprise called Fox News in the United States, which is a mass sexual harassment operation, it seems. No, but that's true. That's just objective data. No, I'm not saying anything that isn't completely out in the public record. But the point I'm making is that you can stoke this kind of division, and we know the Russians bought huge amount of Facebook and Twitter and Google advertisements and banners and set up phony groups, probably in cahoots with the Trump people. And that's another part of what's going on. So we have a big political institutional challenge more than a human challenge here. But I also do agree, the more the public is educated, the better off we're going to be.
I think on that note, I will close the session. We saw passion. We saw a bit of a gloomy picture of where the world is going, but at least there are also some potential solutions. The 6 transitions that you were talking about are actually feasible. They take a lot of hard work and a lot of commitment, a lot of political will, but I do personally think that they're feasible. As a footnote, I would like to say that we at SMU are probably interested in pursuing this whole idea of sustainability and work with many partners, and that we plan for a zero-emission building. So
wonderful.
Even in Singapore, we can actually produce enough energy to compensate for all the consumption that we have for our air conditioning in some of our buildings. Thank you very much for that passion and for the comments on the institutional arrangements in the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you.